Caleb Hayes was 10 years old when he huddled at the bottom of the cracked earth of the Widow's Well, a 15-foot deep hole abandoned in the hills of rural West Virginia that everyone in the county said was haunted. As dawn broke, the weak light filtering through the mouth of the well revealed a metallic glint between the fissures of dry dirt. Digging with his bare, dirt-caked hands, he unearthed a small silver coin, then another, and finally a rotten wooden chest that fell apart as he touched it, revealing a fortune that shimmered in the morning gloom. He saw dozens of coins, a few old pieces of jewelry, and a single cloth-wrapped document. But as he stared at the contents, a profound wave of despair, not joy, washed over him, and tears began to stream down his face, mixing with the dust on his cheeks. He wasn't crying because he was saved. He was crying because he understood this discovery was not an escape, but the beginning of an impossible choice that would define him forever. This single moment of discovery, buried deep in the earth, holds the key to a story of incredible resilience and integrity. It's a narrative that reminds us of the strength hidden in the most vulnerable of hearts, and we believe stories like this deserve to be shared far and wide. If you're already captivated by Caleb's journey, we would be incredibly grateful if you took a moment to let us know where in the world you are listening from in the comments section below. Your engagement helps us build a community around these powerful tales. Please consider leaving a like on this story and subscribing to the channel, as your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important narratives to light for everyone to hear. It truly makes a world of difference for us and ensures you won't miss what happens next. But to truly understand why a 10-year-old runaway boy, upon finding a treasure that could solve all his problems, felt not a surge of euphoria, but the crushing weight of an impossible decision, we must go back. We need to travel back just 24 hours to a quiet Sunday afternoon in a ramshackle cabin nestled deep in an Appalachian hollow. It was there, while mending a splintered fence post under the oppressive summer sun, that Caleb overheard a conversation that was never meant for his ears. It was a conversation that stripped away the last remnants of his childhood innocence and set him on a desperate path that would ultimately lead him to the bottom of that dark, forgotten well, face to face with another person's long-lost legacy. Caleb Hayes was a boy of 10, but his eyes held the weary caution of someone much older. For 2 years, ever since the fever that had stolen both his parents and left him an orphan in the care of his mother's brother, Silas, he had learned to navigate the world with a quiet, watchful stillness. He lived in a small weathered cabin, tucked away in a West Virginia hollow, a place where the sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy of oak and hickory trees. His world had shrunk from the warmth of a loving home to the cold, splintered floorboards of his uncle's kitchen, where a thin cot served as his bed. Every morning, the silence was his only companion, a stark contrast to the memory of his mother's singing or his father's laughter, echoes that were growing fainter with each passing day. He was a ghost in his own life, a small shadow moving through the motions of an existence that felt borrowed and unwelcome. The cabin itself was a reflection of his uncle's spirit, neglected, stark, and isolated. It leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing against the Appalachian winds. The air inside was perpetually damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke, dust, and the unspoken resentment that seemed to seep from the very walls. Caleb's life was confined to the property line, a jagged perimeter marked by a crumbling stone wall and a dense thicket of trees that swallowed the horizon in every direction. His days were not filled with the lessons of a schoolhouse or the games of other children, but with the endless, cyclical rhythm of chores that began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. The hollow was not a sanctuary but a cage, its natural beauty rendered oppressive by the profound loneliness that saturated every inch of its soil. His uncle, Silas Hayes, was a man hardened by disappointment, his face a permanent mask of grim resignation. He rarely spoke to Caleb, and when he did, his words were clipped and practical, usually orders related to the upkeep of their meager homestead. There was no cruelty in his actions, but a complete and unnerving absence of affection. He had taken Caleb in, not from a sense of familial duty or love, but from the heavy weight of social obligation, a burden he made Caleb feel with every meal reluctantly shared and every worn-out piece of clothing passed down. Silas moved through the cabin like a stranger, his presence a constant low hum of disapproval that kept Caleb perpetually on edge, forever trying to make himself smaller, quieter, and less of a nuisance in a home where he was clearly not wanted. Caleb's routine was a testament to his resilience, a grueling schedule that would have challenged a grown man. His first task at dawn was to tend to the 5 goats his uncle kept, milking them with small, chapped hands before leading them to their pen. After that, he would haul 2 heavy metal cans of water from the creek, a quarter-mile trek down a steep, rocky path. The rest of his day was a blur of sweeping the packed dirt yard, mending the perpetually breaking fence, and scrubbing both his and Silas's clothes on a washboard with a harsh bar of lye soap. His only respite was the brief moment he had to himself while his uncle was away, working as a groundskeeper on a larger farm miles away. In these quiet hours, Caleb existed for himself, a small boy in a world that demanded he be nothing more than a pair of working hands. Emotionally, Caleb lived in a state of suspended grief, a quiet sorrow that he kept locked deep inside. The only tangible connection he had to the life he'd lost was a pair of faded photographs, one of his mother and one of his father, which he kept carefully folded inside a small plastic bag and hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his cot. He would only dare to look at them late at night, when Silas's heavy snoring filled the cabin. Tracing their smiling faces with his fingertip, he would try to remember the feeling of being held, of being safe, of being loved. These stolen moments were both a comfort and a source of immense pain, a reminder of a world that had vanished, leaving him stranded in a cold and silent present, where his heart had no one to turn to. The concept of care was an abstract memory. He ate what was left in Silas's metal lunch pail at the end of the day, usually a cold piece of cornbread or the remnants of a sandwich. No one asked if he was hungry or if he was well. No one checked on him when he coughed through the night in the cold winter months. He learned to patch his own clothes with a needle and thread he'd found in his mother's old sewing box, another secret treasure he kept hidden away. This self-reliance was not a sign of strength born from guidance, but a harsh necessity born from utter neglect. He was learning to survive, but he was forgetting how to be a child, his innocence eroding day by day under the weight of his responsibilities and the profound lack of human warmth. Over 2 years, this bleak reality had become his normal. He no longer expected a kind word or a gentle touch. He had learned to read his uncle's moods in the way he slammed the cabin door or the force with which he threw his work boots on the floor. Caleb's primary goal each day was to remain invisible, to perform his duties so flawlessly that he would not draw his uncle's attention. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his small frame wiry and tough from the constant labor. He had accepted his fate with the silent resignation of a child who has no other choice, believing that this was simply what life was now. He did not know how to hope for something better, because he could no longer imagine what better might look like. His only real companions were the 5 goats he cared for. He knew each of them by the unique patterns in their coats and the specific tones of their bleats. There was Daisy, the old nanny who was gentle and patient, Jasper, the stubborn buck with one crooked horn, and the 3 younger kids he had helped birth the previous spring. He would sometimes whisper his thoughts to them as he brushed their coarse fur or filled their trough with feed. They were the only living beings in his world who looked at him without judgment or expectation. In their simple animal presence, he found a small measure of comfort, a fleeting sense of connection in his otherwise solitary existence. They were a silent audience to his silent suffering, and their reliance on him gave his difficult days a sliver of purpose. This life was taking a visible toll. At 10 years old, Caleb was small for his age, with a perpetual thinness that spoke of a diet lacking in substance. His hands were calloused, and his knuckles often raw and cracked, especially in the cold. His clothes, hand-me-downs from a charity box, were always a little too small or a little too big, hanging off his bony shoulders. But the deepest change was in his posture. He carried himself with his head slightly bowed, his shoulders curved inward, as if trying to physically shrink himself out of existence. He was a boy fading into the background, his spirit being systematically worn down by the constant grind of work and the heavy burden of being utterly alone in the world. The hollow itself seemed complicit in his isolation. The dense woods that surrounded the cabin were both a barrier and a map etched into his mind. He knew the game trails, the location of the sweetest blackberry bushes, and the shallowest parts of the creek to cross. He knew which trees were best for climbing to get a glimpse of the distant county road, a thin ribbon of asphalt that represented a world he was no longer a part of. This intimate knowledge of the land, gained during his few moments of solitary exploration, was a double-edged sword. It defined the boundaries of his prison, yet it also offered a hidden geography of potential escape routes, a mental blueprint of freedom he was not yet aware he would need. In the weeks leading up to that fateful Sunday, a subtle shift had occurred in the cabin's tense atmosphere. Silas had grown more agitated, his silences heavier and more menacing. He had started spending more of his meager earnings on cheap whiskey, and the empty bottles began to accumulate behind the woodshed. Caleb could overhear him muttering to himself at night, complaining about money, about the farm, about the burden of having another mouth to feed. These were not direct threats, but they were cracks in the fragile foundation of Caleb's existence, tremors that signaled an impending earthquake. He felt a new kind of fear, a vague but persistent anxiety that the precarious stability of his life was about to shatter completely. And so, on that quiet Sunday morning, just 24 hours before his world would be irrevocably altered, Caleb went about his chores with the same methodical precision as always. He milked the goats, hauled the water, and swept the yard. The familiar rhythm of his labor, a small comfort against the rising tide of unease. The air was thick and humid, a typical Appalachian summer day, heavy with the promise of an afternoon thunderstorm. He felt a storm brewing inside the cabin as well. It was the last day of his childhood, the final moment of a terrible and painful normalcy, before he would be forced to confront a truth far worse than the neglect he had grown so accustomed to enduring. It was late Sunday afternoon when the fragile piece of Caleb's world was shattered forever. He was kneeling in the dirt by the goat pen, patiently trying to replace a splintered post in the old fence, a task he'd performed a dozen times before. The air was thick and heavy, hanging over the hollow like a damp blanket, and the drone of cicadas was a constant, monotonous hum in the background. His uncle Silas was standing near the edge of the woods, speaking in low tones with another man. A tall, broad-shouldered figure Caleb recognized as Mr. Davis, the owner of the large commercial farm where Silas worked. Caleb paid them little mind at first, his focus entirely on the rough wood under his hands. But then, a particular phrase, carried on the still air, caught his ear and made him freeze. His small hammer held motionless in mid-air. The voice belonged to Mr. Davis, and it was flat and businesslike, the kind of voice one uses when discussing livestock or equipment. He was talking about needing an extra hand, someone to live on the farm permanently. He described the work in stark detail, mucking out cattle stalls before dawn, hauling feed and doing whatever else the older farmhands didn't want to do. He mentioned a small bunkhouse, a shared space with 2 other men and meals taken in a communal mess hall. There was no mention of schooling, of weekends, or of anything a 10-year-old boy might need. It was a description not of a job, but of a life of pure, unceasing labor, a life stripped down to its most basic functional elements. Caleb felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach as he listened, hidden from their view by the corner of the small shed. Then came the part of the conversation that stopped his heart. Mr. Davis gestured vaguely toward the cabin, his voice dropping slightly, but still clear enough for Caleb to hear every single word. He was talking about Caleb. He referred to him simply as the boy, a nameless, faceless resource. He said he'd heard Silas complaining about the burden of raising a nephew and was offering a solution that would benefit them both. He proposed taking Caleb off his uncle's hands entirely. In that moment, Caleb realized they were not just talking about work. They were negotiating his future, and he was nothing more than a subject of their transaction, a problem to be solved, an asset to be moved from one place to another. His uncle's response came without a moment of hesitation. There was no argument, no flicker of familial duty, not even a pretense of concern for Caleb's well-being. Instead, Silas's voice held a note of weary relief, the sound of a man eagerly unburdening himself of a heavy load. He agreed instantly, confirming that the boy was strong for his age and a hard worker who didn't cause any trouble. He spoke of Caleb as if he were a piece of farm machinery he was vouching for, listing his practical attributes without a single word of affection or reluctance. The cold, transactional nature of the exchange was absolute. Caleb was not his nephew. He was a commodity, and his value had just been settled between two men who saw him as nothing more. The final, brutal detail was the price. Mr. Davis offered Silas $100 a month, paid directly to him for the boy's labor. $100. For Caleb, the number was an abstraction, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. His life, his freedom, his entire existence had been assigned a monetary value, and it was a price his own uncle had accepted without a second thought. The agreement was sealed with a quiet murmur and the sound of a firm handshake. Mr. Davis said he would expect Silas to bring the boy over first thing Monday morning, ready to start work immediately. Monday morning. The words echoed in Caleb's mind, a death sentence for the little life he knew. He had less than 24 hours before he would be handed over. As the two men walked away, their conversation turning to the price of feed and the weather, Caleb remained frozen behind the shed, the hammer having slipped from his numb fingers into the dirt. The world around him seemed to recede, the buzzing of the cicadas fading to a distant hum. A profound and chilling clarity washed over him. He understood now that he had never been family. He had been an inconvenience, a temporary burden his uncle had tolerated until a more profitable arrangement presented itself. The neglect he had endured was not just a lack of love. It was the precursor to this final act of abandonment. He was being sold, and the realization hit him not with a wave of sadness, but with the cold, hard impact of absolute truth. There was no one to turn to. The idea of pleading with his uncle was laughable. Silas had already made his decision, had already shaken the man's hand, and accepted the terms of the sale. Going to the authorities was an impossible thought for a boy who had never been beyond the next hollow and wouldn't know who to trust. He was trapped. The adults in his life had failed him in the most fundamental way possible, stripping him of his safety and his personhood. He was entirely on his own, facing a future that had been decided for him, a future of servitude from which there would be no easy escape once it began. The fence he was mending suddenly felt like the bars of a cage closing in around him. The shock that had paralyzed him began to recede, replaced by a different feeling, a sharp, primal instinct for survival. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of his stomach, but it was now overlaid with a desperate, burgeoning resolve. He could not let Monday morning come. He could not allow his uncle to lead him to that farm like an animal to slaughter. The vague, childish daydreams of running away, of finding a better life somewhere else, were no longer fantasies. They had become an immediate life-or-death necessity. His only option was to disappear before the sun rose on Monday, to vanish into the woods he knew so well and take his chances with the unknown. He stayed hidden until he saw Mr. Davis's truck rumble away down the dirt track, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. He watched as his uncle walked back toward the cabin, a grim satisfaction on his face. Silas did not look for him, did not call his name to finish his chore. In his uncle's mind, Caleb was already gone. His purpose served, his future settled. This final casual act of disregard was the last piece of evidence Caleb needed. The threat was not a possibility, it was a certainty. The conversation he had overheard was not a negotiation, it was the finalization of a sale. And as the sun began to dip below the Appalachian hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that he would not be there to see it rise again from his uncle's cabin. The raw, paralyzing shock that had frozen Caleb behind the woodshed began to thaw, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that felt unnervingly adult. He understood with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his life in the hollow was over. This was not a choice between staying and leaving. It was a choice between being sold and being free, however terrifying that freedom might be. The decision was not made in a moment of emotional outburst, but in the silent, logical processing of an undeniable truth. He could not wait for Monday morning. He could not allow his uncle to lead him to Mr. Davis's farm. He had to disappear. The plan was not yet formed, but the intention was absolute, forged in the fire of betrayal. He would run, and he would do it tonight, under the cover of the Appalachian darkness that he knew better than anyone. Forcing his numb limbs to move, Caleb walked back to the goat pen and picked up his hammer, resuming his work on the fence post with a mechanical, detached precision. He could not afford to act differently, to give his uncle any reason to suspect that the world had just cracked open beneath his feet. He finished the repair, his movements steady and deliberate, his face a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. As he worked, he watched Silas from the corner of his eye, studying his uncle's posture, the way he moved, the rhythm of his evening routine. He needed to know when the man would drink his whiskey, when he would finally retreat to his room, and when his heavy, alcohol-fueled sleep would provide the window of opportunity he so desperately needed. Every normal action was now a piece of intelligence gathering for the most important mission of his life. Later, inside the dim, oppressive silence of the cabin, Caleb sat at the small kitchen table while Silas ate his meager supper. He did not eat. He said he wasn't hungry, a claim his uncle accepted with an indifferent shrug. While Silas was preoccupied, Caleb's mind was racing, charting a course through the wilderness that existed only in his memory. He visualized the familiar landmarks in the dark, the crooked oak tree that marked the turnoff to the old logging trail, the shallowest part of the creek to cross without making a splash, the steep ridge that would hide him from the main dirt road. He thought of the stories the old-timers told about the widow's well, a deep, dry hole a few miles away that was supposedly haunted. People avoided it, which in his current situation made it sound less like a threat and more like a sanctuary, a perfect place to hide until he could figure out what to do next. His preparation was a silent, desperate inventory of what little he had. There was no backpack to fill, no pantry to raid for food without alerting Silas. His worldly possessions consisted of the worn clothes on his back and the secret cache beneath the loose floorboard under his cot. He knew he could take one of the plastic water bottles from the counter without it being missed. That, and the 2 faded photographs of his parents, carefully wrapped in a small plastic bag. Those were his only essential provisions. Water to sustain his body and the memory of their love to sustain his spirit. He understood with a heavy heart that he would be stepping into the unknown with almost nothing. But the alternative was to stay and have nothing, not even himself. His freedom was the only thing he could carry. As the sun disappeared completely and a deep, rural darkness enveloped the hollow, the tension inside the cabin became almost unbearable. Every sound was amplified in Caleb's heightened state of awareness. The groan of the floorboards as Silas moved about, the scrape of a chair, the clink of the glass bottle as his uncle poured another measure of cheap whiskey. Time itself seemed to slow down and stretch out, each minute an eternity of waiting. Caleb lay on his cot, his eyes closed, breathing evenly to feign sleep, while his heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The moon began to rise, its pale light filtering through the grimy window pane, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. He knew that this night was both his only chance and a ticking clock, counting down the final hours of his childhood. Lying perfectly still in the encroaching darkness, Caleb engaged in his final, most crucial preparation. He prepared his heart. He allowed the full weight of his grief and fear to wash over him, not to be consumed by it, but to pass through it. He pictured his mother's smile and his father's kind eyes, drawing strength from the fading memories. This was not just an escape from servitude. It was the final, definitive act of becoming an orphan, of severing the last corrupted tie to a life that had once held family. He was about to willingly make himself homeless and alone in a world that had already proven to be unkind. He had to find a reservoir of courage he never knew he possessed, a resolve built not on a fantasy of a better future, but on the cold, hard reality of the one he was leaving behind. Sometime after 9 o'clock, the sounds from his uncle's room changed. The restless shuffling and muttered curses ceased, replaced by a low, guttural snoring that began to fill the small cabin. It was a familiar sound, one he had heard countless nights before, but tonight it was not an annoyance. It was the signal. It was the sound of his cage door swinging open. He knew from experience that once Silas was asleep after drinking, a thunderstorm wouldn't wake him. The moment he had been waiting for with breathless anticipation had finally arrived. There was no more time for doubt or hesitation. The mental map was drawn, the meager resources were identified, and the path ahead was clear, at least for the first few steps. The time for thinking was over. With a slowness that was agonizing, Caleb slid off his cot, his bare feet making no sound on the worn wooden floor. He moved like a shadow, a ghost in his own home, his every muscle tensed for the single action that would change his life forever. He retrieved the plastic water bottle from the counter and, in a single fluid motion, knelt by his cot, lifted the loose floorboard, and secured the small bag containing the photographs of his parents in his pocket. He crept to the cabin's main door, his hand trembling slightly as it reached for the cold, rusted iron latch. This was the final boundary, the point of no return. Opening this door meant stepping into a vast, uncertain wilderness. He took one last, silent breath, lifted the latch without a sound, and slipped out into the cool, indifferent darkness of the Appalachian night. The cool night air was a shock against his skin, a sudden sharp contrast to the stale, oppressive atmosphere of the cabin he had just left behind. For a few terrifying seconds, Caleb stood frozen just outside the door, his entire body a single, taut nerve, listening for any sound from within. He expected to hear the scrape of his uncle's chair, a muttered curse, the heavy thud of boots on the floor. But there was only the rhythmic, guttural snore, a sound that was now his shield. He took a single, deliberate step, then another, moving across the small porch with a slowness that felt agonizing. Each creak of the old floorboards under his bare feet sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence of the hollow. He reached the edge of the porch, a small victory, and lowered himself onto the packed dirt of the yard, the rough ground cold and gritty beneath his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His intimate knowledge of the property was now his most valuable weapon. He knew the yard was a minefield of potential noise, loose rocks, dry twigs, and a patch of gravel near the woodshed that crunched loudly underfoot. He skirted these obstacles with a practiced grace born of years of trying to remain invisible. He moved in a wide arc around the cabin, keeping to the softer earth where his footsteps would be muffled. The familiar chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl provided a thin blanket of sound, a fragile camouflage for his desperate flight. His senses were on fire, every nerve ending screaming with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. He was a small shadow detaching itself from the larger shadow of the cabin, a silent, determined ghost making a break from his own haunted past. He was leaving behind the only home he had known for 2 years, and every step felt like a betrayal and a salvation all at once. Reaching the crumbling stone wall that marked the property line felt like crossing into another world. He slipped through a familiar gap where the stones had long since fallen away, and was immediately swallowed by the deep, profound darkness of the woods. Here, under the thick canopy of oak and hickory trees, the faint moonlight was almost completely blocked, plunging him into a world of texture and sound. He navigated by touch, his left hand trailing along the rough bark of the trees he knew, his feet learning the terrain by feel alone. He knew this first stretch of the woods well, the path worn into his memory from countless solitary wanderings. But tonight, the familiar woods felt different. They were no longer a place of quiet refuge, but a vast, menacing wilderness, and he was a trespasser running for his life, with only the memory of a trail to guide his uncertain steps forward. Suddenly a sharp tearing sound ripped through the quiet night, and a searing pain shot through his arm. He had misjudged his path in the darkness and walked directly into a thicket of blackberry briars he had forgotten was there. A thorny vine snagged the sleeve of his thin shirt, holding him fast. He froze instantly, his breath catching in his throat, his ears straining for any sign that the noise had carried back to the cabin. The silence that answered was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. The fabric of his shirt had ripped, and he could feel the warm, sticky trickle of blood on his forearm where the thorns had dug into his skin. It was a small, seemingly insignificant failure, but in his heightened state of anxiety, it felt like a catastrophic error, a loud announcement of his escape to the entire sleeping hollow. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, a cold wave that urged him to yank his arm free and run blindly into the night. But some deeper instinct, a core of resilience forged in 2 years of silent suffering, took hold. He forced himself to take a slow, steadying breath. He could not afford to make more noise. With painstaking care, he began to work himself free, his fingers fumbling with the thorny vine in the pitch-black darkness. His hands were scratched and bleeding by the time he finally pulled his torn sleeve away. He had lost precious minutes and gained a painful injury, but he was free. He gave the briar patch a wide berth. Moving more slowly now, his initial burst of adrenaline tempered by a new, more cautious awareness of the dangers that lurked in the familiar darkness around him. The forest was not his ally, it was simply indifferent, a neutral ground he had to conquer. Soon he reached the next major obstacle on his mental map, the creek that snaked through the bottom of the hollow. It was not wide, but the sound of splashing water could travel a long way on a still night. He crept to the edge of the bank listening. The gentle gurgle of the current was a constant, soothing sound, but he knew the rocks beneath the surface were slick with moss and treacherous. He couldn't risk a fall. He followed the bank downstream for 50 yards to the spot he knew was shallowest, where a line of flat, stable stones offered a path across. Taking off his worn sneakers and tying the laces together, he slung them around his neck. The icy shock of the water as he stepped in stole his breath, the cold seeping into his bones, a brutal physical reminder of how alone and exposed he truly was in the vast wilderness. He moved from stone to stone with the concentration of a tightrope walker, his bare feet searching for purchase on the slippery surfaces. The water swirled around his ankles, its current stronger than he remembered. He was halfway across when his foot slipped on a patch of algae. He flailed wildly for a moment, his arms windmilling in the dark, the plastic water bottle in his hand nearly flying from his grasp. He managed to catch his balance at the last possible second, his other foot planting firmly on the creek bed, sending a small splash echoing into the night. He froze again, his body rigid with fear, listening, waiting. But the only response was the indifferent murmur of the water and the steady thrum of the crickets. He had been clumsy. He had made a noise, but he had not fallen. He had survived another small failure. Reaching the opposite bank was a monumental victory. He scrambled up the muddy incline, his legs shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. He had done it. He had put a significant physical barrier between himself and his uncle. He sat for a moment in the damp grass, hidden by a curtain of willows, and looked back across the water. There was nothing to see, only an impenetrable wall of darkness where the cabin and his old life lay. The full weight of his situation settled upon him. There was no turning back now. A profound sense of loneliness washed over him, so vast and complete it was almost dizzying. But mixed with the fear was a tiny, unfamiliar spark of something else, a fragile sense of control. He was making his own choices now, and though they were terrifying, they were his. He pulled his wet shoes back on, the damp chill seeping into his socks, and continued his journey. The terrain on this side of the creek was steeper and less familiar. He was now relying on the old logging trail he had only followed a few times, a faint path that was more of a suggestion than a clear route. The moon had risen higher, and its pale, silvery light now filtered through the trees in patches, offering just enough illumination to make out the shapes of rocks and roots in his path. The physical toll of his flight was beginning to set in. His legs ached with a deep, burning fatigue, his scratched arm throbbed with every movement, and a profound exhaustion began to creep over him, weighing down his limbs and slowing his pace. He was just a boy, and his small body was reaching its limit. The woods here were different, wilder. The sounds were louder, stranger. An owl screeched somewhere nearby, a sound so close and piercing it made him jump. A branch snapped in the undergrowth to his left, and he imagined a bear, a coyote, or something worse. He knew these were most likely just the normal sounds of the forest at night. But his exhausted mind began to play tricks on him. Every shadow seemed to morph into the shape of a pursuing man. He clutched the water bottle in one hand and kept the other in his pocket, his fingers wrapped around the small plastic bag containing the photographs of his parents. It was his only talisman against the encroaching fear, a tangible link to a time when he had been safe, a silent prayer that he might one day be safe again. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the trees began to thin, and he saw a change in the light ahead. It was a clearing, bathed in the soft grey glow of the approaching dawn, and there, in the very center of the clearing, was a dark circle in the earth, a gaping maw that seemed to have swallowed the very light around it. It was the widow's well. He had made it. Exhaustion and relief washed over him in a dizzying wave, making his knees feel weak. The stories said the place was haunted, a site of tragedy and sorrow. But as Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing, his small frame trembling with cold and fatigue, he felt no fear of ghosts. The well was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was a hiding place. It was the first destination he had ever chosen for himself, and it represented the hope of a new, undiscovered future. The bottom of the widow's well was a small, circular world of its own, a pocket of deep silence and profound darkness. Caleb curled himself into a tight ball against the cold, damp earth, his body trembling from a combination of exhaustion, fear, and the lingering chill of the creek. For the first time in hours, however, he was not moving. He was hidden. The 15-foot walls of cracked dirt rose up around him like a fortress, and the small patch of starry sky visible above was a distant, unreachable promise of the outside world. Here, at the bottom of a forgotten hole, he felt a strange and paradoxical sense of security. No one would think to look for him here. For the first night in 2 years, he was not under his uncle's roof, and this terrifying freedom was accompanied by the first real sense of safety he had felt since his parents were alive. He was alone and invisible, and for now that was enough to still the frantic beating of his heart. He must have drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, because when he opened his eyes again, the patch of sky above was no longer black but a pale, washed-out grey. Dawn was breaking. The light descended into the well not as a warm, hopeful glow, but as a weak, hesitant illumination that seemed to get tangled in the morning mist. It crept down the earthen walls, revealing the texture of the dry soil, the intricate network of cracks, and the stubborn roots of long-dead trees that protruded like skeletal fingers. The world was waking up, and with it, a new kind of anxiety began to stir in Caleb's chest. The darkness had been a shield, but the light brought with it the risk of discovery. He pressed himself further against the wall, trying to merge with the shadows, hoping to remain a secret for just a little while longer as the new day began to assert its presence in his temporary sanctuary. And it was in that faint, revealing light that he saw it. This was the moment that had opened our story, the pivot upon which his entire future would turn. A metallic glint, small and unassuming, caught his eye from a fissure in the packed earth near his feet. It was not the shiny reflection of something new, but the dull, soft gleam of old metal. For a moment, he simply stared, his exhausted mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It could have been anything. A discarded piece of tin, a lost button, a piece of trash thrown into the well years ago. But a deep primal curiosity, stronger than his fatigue and his fear, began to pull at him. He shifted his weight, the stiffness in his limbs a painful reminder of his night-long journey, and reached out a tentative, dirt-caked hand toward the source of the faint light. Driven by an instinct he didn't understand, he began to dig. His fingers, already raw and scratched from his escape through the briars, scraped against the hard-packed dirt. The work was slow and arduous. The soil was dry and compacted, almost like soft stone, and he had no tools but his own small hands. He chipped away at the earth, pebble by pebble, handful by handful, the glinting object his only motivation. The silence of the well was broken by the soft, rhythmic sound of his own labor, a desperate scratching that echoed faintly in the enclosed space. He was no longer just hiding. He was on a mission, consumed by the singular focus of unearthing whatever secret the ground had been holding for so long. The rest of the world, his uncle, the farm, all of it faded away, replaced by the simple physical act of digging toward the unknown. His fingertips finally brushed against something cold, round and solid. He worked it free from the dirt and held it in the palm of his hand. It was a silver coin, heavy and tarnished with age, bearing the profile of a woman he did not recognize. It felt ancient, a relic from another time. A jolt of excitement, the first positive emotion he had felt in what seemed like a lifetime, shot through him. He dug again with renewed vigor, his heart beginning to pound with a new kind of rhythm, not of fear, but of anticipation. A few inches deeper, his fingers found another coin and then another. They were not just scattered pieces, they were clustered together, a small, concentrated hoard of forgotten wealth. He was no longer just finding lost change, he was uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden, A deliberate and secret collection of value. His frantic digging soon revealed the source. Buried just beneath the collection of loose coins was the dark, crumbling shape of wood. He cleared the dirt away with a growing sense of awe, slowly exposing the outline of a small, rectangular box. It was in a terrible state of decay, the wood dark with moisture and age, so soft and rotten that it seemed to be held together by the very earth that had protected it for so long. It was not a grand, iron-bound chest from a storybook, but something far more humble. A simple wooden chest, the kind a person might use to store their most precious personal belongings. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. This was not just lost money. It was someone's entire world, their savings, their secrets buried deep in the ground and forgotten by time. With a trembling hand, he reached out and touched the lid of the chest. The moment his fingers made contact, the fragile wood gave way, collapsing inward with a soft, sighing sound. It didn't open so much as it dissolved, the rotten planks falling apart to reveal the contents within. And there, nestled in a bed of decayed wood and dark earth, was a sight that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. Dozens of silver and gold coins shimmered in the weak morning light, their surfaces glowing with a soft internal fire. Tucked among them were a few pieces of old jewelry, a simple silver locket, a delicate gold chain, and a ring with a small dark stone. It was a fortune, a lifetime of savings that glittered impossibly in the gloom of the well, a treasure beyond anything his 10-year-old mind could have possibly imagined. But as his eyes scanned the incredible collection of coins and jewels, they settled on something else, something that seemed far more important than all the gold and silver combined. Tucked to one side, wrapped carefully in a square of what had once been oilcloth, was a single folded document. The cloth was brittle and yellowed with age, but it had done its job, protecting the paper within from the worst of the dampness. A profound sense of reverence and hesitation washed over him. The coins were just objects, valuable but impersonal. This document was different. It felt like a voice, a story, a direct connection to the person who had buried this treasure so many years ago. His hand hovered over it, a sudden fear of disturbing the final message of a long-gone soul, and so we arrive back at the moment that began this entire story. Caleb stared at the impossible treasure before him, the solution to all his problems lying at his feet. With this, he could run away forever, buy food, find a safe place to live, and never have to worry about his uncle or Mr. Davis again. But as this realization dawned, a profound and overwhelming wave of despair, not joy, washed over him. Tears began to stream down his face, carving clean paths through the layers of dust and grime on his cheeks. He wasn't crying because he was saved. He was crying because he understood with a certainty that was both chilling and absolute, that this discovery was not an escape. It was the beginning of an impossible choice, a burden of history and integrity that would challenge the very core of who he was and who he was meant to become. His fingers, trembling slightly, closed around the cloth-wrapped package. It felt different from the cold, hard finality of the coins. This was soft, yielding, and held a different kind of weight, the weight of intention. The gold and silver were a treasure, an impersonal collection of value that could belong to anyone. But this felt like a secret, a last will and testament whispered into the earth. A sudden, sharp feeling of being an intruder washed over him. He was a grave robber, not of a body, but of a story, one that had been carefully sealed and buried for reasons he couldn't possibly fathom. For a long moment he simply held it in his palm, the rough texture of the old oilcloth a fragile barrier between his world and the world of someone long dead. He hesitated, knowing that whatever was inside this package had the power to change not just his circumstances, but the very meaning of his discovery. With a deep, steadying breath, he began to carefully unwrap the package. The oilcloth, stiff and brittle with age, cracked and flaked away under his gentle touch, releasing a faint, musty smell of earth and time. Inside, protected from the dampness for decades, was a single sheet of paper, folded into a neat square. It was yellowed to the color of old ivory, and the edges were soft and worn. As he unfolded it, the paper made a delicate, crinkling sound that seemed impossibly loud in the deep silence of the well. The ink on the page was a faded brown, but the handwriting was surprisingly clear, a careful, deliberate script from a hand that was used to patient, steady work. He smoothed the document out on his thigh, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It was not a map or a deed, but a letter, and its first few words seemed to reach across the years to speak directly to him. The letter was dated October 12th, 1938. It began not with a formal salutation, but with a simple, direct address. To whomever finds this. The author introduced himself as John Benedict, a man of 67 years, a former coal miner who had once owned the small parcel of land where this well now stood. He wrote that he was ailing, his lungs filled with the dust of the mines, and he knew his time was short. He was writing this letter from the porch of his small shack, which he described as standing just 50 paces east of this very spot. The specificity of the date, the name, and the location stripped away any fantasy of pirates or forgotten bank robbers. This was not a fairy tale treasure. This was real. This was the life savings of a man whose name was John Benedict, and Caleb was the first person to read his final words in over half a century. John Benedict's story began to unfold on the fragile page, a tale of hardship that resonated with a painful familiarity in Caleb's young heart. He wrote of the Great Depression, of losing his small family farm to the bank in 1931 after a season of drought. He didn't write with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness, describing the shame of watching a lifetime of his family's work be auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. He wrote about the feeling of being powerless, of having the ground beneath his feet, the very earth he had tilled since he was a boy, taken away by forces he could not fight. Caleb, a boy who had just lost his own family and was about to lose his own freedom, felt a deep, gut-wrenching pang of recognition. He was not just reading a story. He was hearing an echo of his own deepest fears and losses. The letter went on to detail the years that followed. To survive, John had gone to work in the coal mines, a brutal, dangerous job that stole the light from his days and the air from his lungs. He described the darkness, the constant fear of a collapse and the back-breaking labor that wore men down to bone and sinew. But he also wrote of his singular driving purpose. Every coin in this chest, he explained, was a piece of that sacrifice. He had saved every spare cent, living on almost nothing, driven by a fierce, quiet determination to reclaim a piece of what he had lost. He wanted to build something that the banks and the hard times could not take away from him again. This chest was not just money. It was his rebellion, his testament to a life of resilience, a small fortune built from dust and darkness. He then explained why he had buried it. His health was failing from the black lung, the miner's curse, and he had no wife or children, no family left to inherit what he had so painstakingly saved. He was deeply mistrustful of the banks that had ruined him and feared that if he died, the government would simply absorb his life's work, leaving no trace of his struggle. So he had buried it here, on the land that was still his in his heart, a final act of defiance. He entrusted his legacy to the earth with the faint hope that one day it would be found not by a thief, but by someone who understood its true worth, someone who knew what it felt like to have nothing and to fight for everything. It was a desperate prayer, a message in a bottle cast not into the sea, but into the deep, silent soil of Appalachia. And then came the words that landed in Caleb's soul like a physical weight. "This is not just money," John Benedict had written. "It is the sum of a man's days on this earth. It is the cost of his sweat and the price of his breath." He made a simple, profound request of the unknown finder, that they use it not for waste or vice, but to build a life of dignity, to secure a foundation of safety that he himself had lost. The letter was no longer a story from the past. It had become a direct and personal charge, a moral instruction passed down through time. In that moment, Caleb was no longer an anonymous runaway who had stumbled upon a windfall. He was the person John Benedict had been writing to all those years ago. He was the answer to the old miner's prayer. The stark contrast between his own desperate plans and the miner's solemn last wish struck Caleb with an almost violent force. Just minutes before, he had seen these shimmering coins as his ticket to freedom, a means to escape his uncle and the life of servitude that awaited him. He had imagined buying food, a bus ticket to a faraway city, a new life where no one knew him. But now he saw that vision through John Benedict's eyes. To use this money for his own escape would be to treat it as nothing more than cash. It would be a betrayal of the man who had earned it, a desecration of the legacy he had died to protect. The treasure was not a solution to his problems. It was a sacred trust, a life story placed directly into his hands for safekeeping. And that is when the tears truly began to fall, the ones we saw at the very beginning of this story. They were not tears of self-pity for his own terrible situation. They were tears of profound, overwhelming empathy for a man he had never met. He wept for John Benedict, the farmer who lost his land. He wept for the coal miner who had sacrificed his health for a handful of coins. He wept for the lonely old man who had died with no one to pass his legacy on to, forced to trust a complete stranger to honor his life's work. In the cold, dim light of the well, a 10-year-old boy cried for the soul of another human being, his own small sorrows momentarily eclipsed by the weight of a much larger historical grief. He looked down again at the scattered coins and the tarnished jewelry lying in the dirt. They no longer shimmered with the promise of escape. Instead, they seemed to glow with a different kind of light, the light of memory and meaning. Each silver dollar was a day spent in the suffocating darkness of the mine. The delicate gold chain was a memory of a life before the hardship. The treasure had been transformed before his very eyes. It was no longer a pile of anonymous wealth, it was a monument, an archive of one man's resilience against a world that had tried to crush him. The responsibility to protect that monument felt infinitely heavier and more important than the desire to save himself. It was a weight that settled not in his pockets, but on his conscience. He finally understood the impossible choice that had brought him to tears. The path of survival was clear. Take the money, disappear, and live. No one would ever know. It was the logical, practical thing to do. It was what any rational person in his position would choose. But to do so would be to extinguish the last flicker of John Benedict's life. It would be to treat his legacy as a disposable resource. The alternative was to honor the man's story, to ensure it was not forgotten. But that path meant walking out of this well with nothing but the clothes on his back, straight back into the terrifying uncertainty of his own life. The choice was not between poverty and wealth. It was a choice between his own physical freedom and the preservation of another man's soul. In that moment, holding the faded letter from 1938, something fundamental shifted inside Caleb Hayes. The fear and desperation that had driven him through the night began to recede, replaced by a strange and powerful sense of purpose. He was no longer just a victim, a runaway boy at the mercy of cruel adults. He was now the sole guardian of John Benedict's story. His own suffering felt less isolating, connected now to a long, human chain of struggle, dignity, and quiet defiance. He knew with an unshakable certainty that settled deep in his bones what he had to do. The decision was no longer impossible. It was the only one he could make. He would not use this treasure to save himself. He would use his own integrity to save the memory of the man who had earned it. With a resolve that felt ancient and profound, Caleb carefully rewrapped John Benedict's letter in the tattered oilcloth and placed it back among the coins. He left the treasure where it lay, a silent monument in the earth, and began the arduous climb out of the widow's well. His journey was not over. It had just found its true direction. He walked for another hour, following the dirt track until it met the paved county road, and from there, he made his way to the small town that served as the county seat. He walked directly into the sheriff's office, his small frame covered in dirt and his clothes torn, and asked to speak with the man in charge. To Sheriff Arthur Thompson, a weary but kind-eyed man in his 50s, Caleb recounted his entire story with a quiet, unshakable honesty, from the neglect to the sale to the escape, and finally to the treasure and the letter that had changed everything. He didn't ask for help for himself. He asked for help to honor the memory of a man named John Benedict. Sheriff Thompson, moved by the boy's incredible integrity, immediately set the wheels of justice in motion. Child Protective Services was called, and an investigation was launched that swiftly confirmed Caleb's story of neglect and his uncle's cruel arrangement with Mr. Davis. Silas Hayes lost guardianship permanently, facing legal consequences for his actions. Simultaneously, the State Historical Preservation Office was contacted about the find. The treasure from the widow's well was carefully recovered and declared a significant historical discovery for the region. As per state law regarding such finds, and in recognition of his extraordinary honesty, Caleb was granted a legal reward of $8,000, which was placed into a protected trust fund. Furthermore, the state awarded him a full academic scholarship, ensuring his education would be secure. John Benedict's life savings, his testament of resilience, became the centerpiece of a new exhibit at the County Museum, his story finally told and honored for all to see. The most profound change in Caleb's life, however, came not from a government office but from the sheriff himself, Sheriff Thompson and his wife Joanne, whose own children were grown and had moved away, saw in Caleb a strength and character that touched them deeply. They opened their home to him, becoming his foster parents and providing him with the stability, care, and quiet affection he had been starved of for so long. It was not a magical fix. Caleb remained a quiet and reserved boy, carrying the weight of his past. When he turned 13, he asked them not to formally adopt him, explaining his desire to keep the last name of the parents he still loved and remembered. The Thompsons understood and respected his need to preserve his own identity, a testament to their genuine love and commitment to his healing, not just his housing. They became his family on his own terms, a foundation of support from which he could finally begin to build his future. Years later, at 21, Caleb Hayes stood on his own 7 acres of rolling Appalachian land, purchased with the reward money that had matured in his trust fund. He had used his scholarship to study agricultural science, and now he was the proud owner of a small but thriving goat farm, producing artisanal cheeses that were becoming well known in the local farmers' markets. The 5 goats he had once cared for out of duty were replaced by a herd of his own, a living symbol of his journey from servitude to self-determination. He was a quiet, independent young man, the master of his own life, his future shaped not by the gold he had found, but by the moral courage he had discovered within himself at the bottom of a well. The greatest treasure John Benedict had left behind was not a chest of coins, but the opportunity for a lost boy to choose a life of dignity, a choice that had